Welcome to Talking Africa, the podcast that deconstructs the news from the continent, brought to you by the Africa Report magazine. My name's Nick Norbrook. Some quick housekeeping. For those of you interested in Nigeria, we have a special 15-page report on the politics and economy of the country, packed with interesting interviews and analysis, really worthwhile. Head to theafricareport.com for more details on how to download it for free. Now, in this episode, the microphone is turned back on me for a change by our partners at Radio France International. I speak to RFI's Olia Horton about some of the forthcoming pieces in the Africa Report magazine and on our website on how Nigerian fintech came ablaze with investor interest and on Angola's dream deferred.
So our guest today is Nicholas Norbrook, the managing editor of the Africa Report. Thank you so much for being my guest on Paris Live.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Today we're looking at a couple of stories. One of them is the mobile money business in Nigeria and how China is getting involved. We're also going to have an update on the general ambience in Angola 2 years on from the election and where they're up to there. So we'll begin perhaps with the Nigeria story. The article is entitled China-backed OPay gets big on Nigeria's fintech opportunities. So my first question to you, Nick, is what is fintech exactly, and in particular in this context? What are we talking about? What's mobile money business?
Well, fintech covers actually an incredibly large range of things. So at its most basic, it is a transfer of cash from one person to the other, and it's from they're called wallets, digital wallets. Listeners will know perhaps M-Pesa in Kenya made it famous, really. This ability to use your mobile phone to send money from one mobile phone to another mobile phone. And actually, I mean, we sit here in Europe surrounded by, this fantastic gleaming studio here at RFI. But actually, Europe is a bit of a laggard when it comes to mobile money. Africa is far in advance in terms of what you're able to do, real-time movements of money from one person to another. Whereas here, it might take 3 days for your bank to do the settlement. In Kenya, it's instantaneous. And an incredible amount of money moves around the economy, especially in Kenya, like that. Nigeria is a bit of has been slower in the uptake of mobile money, but that is all changing. The big mobile phone company there, MTN, is now has got a mobile money license, so it's getting into the game. Meanwhile, there is an absolute constellation of other fintech operators in Nigeria, which range from the very large to the much more modest. One of the bigger ones, in fact, one of the ones which probably does deserve the title of unicorn, a tech company worth $1 billion, is Interswitch. They have recently announced that they are, going to receive about $200 million of investment from Visa. Now, Visa itself, we know Visa and its competitor MasterCard. We know Visa, that is fintech as well. That helps process payments internationally. And Interswitch does a similar job for Nigeria and is also expanding into Africa. Now, there is another fintech player called OPay. They are linked to the Opera browser, which is a web browser and app, which was bought by Chinese investors a few months ago, perhaps a few years ago, for about $600 million. And now, their OPay app is being purchased by some Chinese investors again, which is an interesting change. We've seen an incredible amount of Chinese money go into infrastructure. There's been a lot of, oil for road type deals which were signed, especially over the last 15 years, and will get onto Angola in a moment. That's a very classic example of the first big waves of Chinese capital coming into Africa, which was really to lock down resources and, build roads. This sort of second big wave we're seeing now is going into services, it's going into telecoms, it's going into, consumer type products, which is a big change. And I think everyone's readjusting to the fact that, China is in it for the long term. It's not just, trying to secure oil. It does see Africa as a place that is worth putting money in, especially into mobile money. It's been such a success in Kenya. There's no reason it wouldn't be a success in Nigeria, I imagine, is what they're thinking.
So what does China want out of this? I mean, you've just mentioned that it's not just about, getting a foothold in the country. That seems to be something more. They're in it for the long haul. And conversely, what are Nigerians getting out of it? How do they see this innovation?
Well, there's a lot of pride in Nigeria at the sort of the incredible growth of the technology sector there. And, we're talking about this quite specific fintech, but there are lots of other technology companies. Jack Ma, the very famous Chinese billionaire who launched Alibaba and is launching other trading platforms now within Africa, recently had a Netrepreneur Prize, I believe, which was won by a Nigerian tech entrepreneur who was doing blood deliveries, which started in a place called CC Hub, one of the early places where Nigerian tech companies were nurtured and, brought to life. And I think that, so, there's a lot of pride that it's not just Silicon Valley companies who are now moving in to purchase Nigerian companies. It's also Chinese companies which are moving in to purchase Nigerian tech companies. And obviously there's a lot of, Nigerian entrepreneurs who want local money, Nigerian money, to invest in it too, to keep some of the value in Nigeria. That's a slightly side debate, but it's certainly one that's going on. But it does, I think, help us move away from this fairly one-dimensional view of Chinese investors in Africa that we've had until now.
Yeah. Are there any concerns for cybersecurity and issues around the technology that we are aware of in the world, the surveillance, things like that?
That is absolutely a question that's not been answered. There are many companies now who are looking to Africa as a place where regulations are so light touch as to be non-existent, and whereas Europe has really tightened up on security, Africa hasn't really worked on these kinds of things at all. And there's a real debate to be had on who owns the data, who owns, the data in various African countries, who is exploiting it, who's getting the benefit of it. There are various companies who offer solutions similar to what we see in China today in terms of facial recognition and, linking that to national databases, with, on the one hand, the argument this is terrific for security, and on the other hand, this could also be used for less democratic purposes.
Let's maybe move on to the next article. And you mentioned just a moment ago that we're going to turn to Angola, and China has shown a lot of interest in Angola. Now, the article that the Africa Report is looking at in this particular edition is entitled "Angolans Feel Let Down 2 years into the New Presidency." Perhaps we could begin with just reminding the listeners who the President, João Lourenço, is and his background. How did he get to the leadership today? Because it's obviously something people had great expectations for, and maybe those expectations haven't been met.
It's probably worth saying that João Lourenço is very much of the system. He isn't someone who fought for a long time as an opposition leader and is now in power. He very much comes from the ruling party. But I think the optimism came from... I think the fact that very early on he took quite a few decisive moves, which indicated he was taking the country in a very different direction. And I wanted to highlight these two articles, actually. One, which we published online on theafricareport.com, and one that we have forthcoming in our next print edition, which will come out in December, which is our big end of year Africa in 2020 edition. And the one we have online, it does point to the fact that a lot of Angolans feel that initial euphoria hasn't borne fruit. That although Lourenço did some reforms in terms of sidelining some of the ruling family who had pillaged the country in the previous few decades, he'd sidelined the daughter, the son, who were in charge of the National Oil Company and the Sovereign Wealth Fund, respectively. He also has allowed critics to speak a lot more freely. Some very notable and tough critics who were facing prison under the previous regime are now receiving awards at the presidential palace. So there has been a genuine change in the openness of what can be said. Nevertheless, the hard facts are, in 2015, 2016, the bottom fell out of the oil market. Prior to that, Angola had, it'd been talking a good game about diversifying the economy, but had done nothing. And so when that big oil crash came, the country was woefully underprepared. And, in a way, it doesn't matter who you have at the helm. The country is going to go through an incredibly difficult moment. And it provides a contrast, I think. The other article, what we're going to publish in our next print edition, which is really focusing much more on the oil sector itself. And, there has been a real change there. The way that... he's separated Sonangol into, the National Oil Company into the regulating part and the part which actually, bids for contracts or makes money. So that's, a big change. He's trying to professionalize it, and they've had a few licensing rounds. They've done some roadshows, and whereas in the past the licensing rounds would be a very, very opaque affair, and a few well-connected businessmen and the Chinese would come out with the oil blocks. Now they're publishing all the names on their website. They're publishing the model contracts on the website. They're communicating. It's possible to get answers to basic questions that investors had. So there has been a real change. They've done things like allow the commercialization of gas. Previously all gas just belonged to Sonangol, which wouldn't really use it, and so there was no incentive for the other oil companies to do anything but flare it, which is what happens in Nigeria. Huge columns of flame offshore, gas just going up into smoke, helping to warm our climate as it happens. Now that gas can be compressed, taken on shore, and sold, and that's what's starting to happen, and that is a real change. Likewise, a lot of the gas is now being used domestically for electrification projects. So I think there will be a net, quite a substantial net gain to the economy from this modernized energy sector. Now, one of the broader points made in the online piece, more critical, was about this IMF deal that Angola has struck, which some see as one of the real progress points of João Lourenço. He's managed to, get a much more coherent and transparent financial plan in place. But critics say, the track record of the IMF in these situations isn't very good. It tends to say austerity first and, we'll ask questions later. And that has led to, various flameouts across the continent in the last 20 years. And indeed, in Europe, where we were much more IMF-like in our response to the 2009 crash, we took a decade to recover, whereas America was for all its talk about being